Hello everyone. Today we're actually going to be talking about the heart. It is part of the cardiovascular system, and that chapter kind of divided into blood pressure as well as the heart. So today we're just going to be focusing on the heart itself. Okay, so to understand basically the topics of the heart, you have to understand the anatomy of the heart. So let's quickly go over it. The heart actually has 4 chambers. The top 2 chambers are called the atria. So you have the right atrium, left atrium. The bottom 2 chambers are called the ventricles. So you have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The atria and the ventricles are actually divided by or separated by a valve called the AV valves. So here's one AV valve, here's another AV valve. On the right side, the AV valve is called tricuspid. On the left side, the AV valve is called bicuspid, or another name is mitral valve. Now, the ventricles always give off vessels, meaning a vessel comes off it and blood goes into it. So the vessels that come off from the right ventricle is the pulmonary artery, or you could call it the pulmonary trunk. The vessel that comes off the left ventricle is the aorta. Between the ventricle and the off-going vessels, you actually have a valve. So on the right side, you have the pulmonary valve. So the pulmonary valve separates the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. On the left side, you actually have the aortic valve, which separates the left ventricle and the aorta. Now, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve is collectively called the semilunar valve. Now, the atria always have incoming blood vessels, meaning blood drains into the atria. So, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava both drain blood into the right atrium, where the left atrium actually gets blood from the pulmonary veins. Lastly, the ventricles, so the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are actually separated by septum. So the ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum, and there's also the interatrial septum, which we cannot see on the image. But the interatrial septum separates the right atrium and the left atrium. Now, so these are again just a brief about the valves. There are 2 types of valves, AV valves and the semilunar valves. AV valves are between the atria and the ventricles, tricuspid on the right side, bicuspid or mitral on the left side. Semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the off-going vessel. On the right side is called the pulmonic valve. On the left side is called the aortic valve. Okay. Blood flow through the heart. This is another important topic that you should recall from anatomy. Okay? So if we quickly go through it, superior and the inferior vena cava drain blood into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it goes to the tricuspid valve, enters the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonic valve, enters the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, it goes into the lungs, gets oxygenated. And from the lungs, it comes back to basically the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary vein drains blood into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it goes through the bicuspid or the mitral valve, enters the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it goes through the aortic valve, enters the aorta, and from the aorta, it now supplies the rest of the body. And of course, rest of the body will, again, the blood will be picked up by the superior and the inferior vena cava from the body. As you can see, this is color coordinated. The right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood, and this is why all of the colors are blue. Left side of the heart has oxygenated blood, and this is why all of the colors are pink or red. So the body, once it gets the blood from the aorta, it's going to extract the oxygen, and then the blood is going to become deoxygenated, which the superior and inferior vena cava will basically pick up that blood and then give it to the right atrium, and then the cycle starts again. Okay. Now let's quickly talk about the conduction system. Conduction system is a specialized group of cells. These cells are found in the heart, and they have lost the ability to contract. As you guys recall from anatomy, the function of the heart is to contract, correct? Well, conduction system are a group of specialized cells as mentioned, and they do not contract, okay? They are actually cells which are designed to monitor and conduct basically the cardiac cycle. So they're supposed to initiate the impulse and spread the impulse throughout the heart so the cardiac cycle can happen. So the function of these cells that make up the conduction system is to initiate and spread the electrical impulse, which is the action potential. And that action potential is needed so the heart, the rest of the cells, can actually contract and eject blood. So the conduction system has 4 arms or 4 parts to it, and it goes in this order. So the first part is SA node, which is also called the pacemaker. Second part is AV node. Third part is bundle of His, which is broken up into left and right bundle branches. And the last part is Purkinje fibers, also called the PJ fibers. Now, let's talk about these segments a little bit more in detail. So you guys can actually be on this slide as well as this slide. I'm actually going to explain everything that was on the previous slide just on this image. Okay? So the first part of the conduction system is A in the image, and that is called the SA node. The function of the SA node is to start the impulse. Okay? It starts the impulse and spreads it to both of the atrias. The way the impulse gets to all of the atrial cells is via the intranodal branches. Now, where is the SA node located? It is actually found within the right atrium. Because the SA node actually fires or starts the impulse, another name for the SA node is pacemaker. Now, so the impulse starts, spreads to both of the atrias, and arrives to the second part. So B in the image is the second part of the conduction system, which is called the AV node. Now, AV node is actually found right between the right atrium and the right ventricle, but if you had to choose a chamber, it's still in the right atrium. What is the function of the what is the function of the AV valve? Not AV valve. What is the function of the AV node? So the function of the AV node is to hold the impulse, to slow it down. So when the impulse comes from the SA node, arrives to the AV node, the function of the AV node is to hold on to it, to slow it down. Now this is very important function. Why? Because it's allowing the impulse to basically slowly, or it's causing a delay so the impulse doesn't arrive that fast at the ventricles. Why is this important? Because as soon as the ventricles receive the impulse, the ventricles will contract and eject the blood. So if you don't hold on to it, the ventricles will not get enough time to fill with blood. So by holding on to the impulse, the AV node ensures that both of these ventricles actually get enough time to fill with blood. And finally, when the ventricles actually receive the impulse, they have enough blood and they can contract and blood can be ejected. So, AV node has a very important function, and it is to slow down or hold on to the impulse, therefore slowing it down. After that, the impulse actually travels to the third segment, which is called bundle of His. The bundle of His is actually located in the interventricular septum. As I mentioned, bundle of His is broken up into 2 segments. So this top part is called the common bundle branch, and then you can see it splits up into 2 different, it forks basically. So this part is called the common bundle branch, then it splits up into the right and left bundle branches. The significance of its splitting is because that branch actually supplies the right side, where this branch supplies the left side of the heart. So AV node holds on to the impulse and sends it to the next segment, which is the bundle of His. Okay? From the bundle of His, the impulse arrives to the ventricles, which the last segment is called the PJ fibers. So these fibers up here, the image is D in the image, it is called the PJ fibers or the Purkinje fibers. So the function of the Purkinje fibers is to spread the impulse throughout the ventricular cells. Now, where are the PGA fibers? As you can see, it's actually located within the ventricle itself. Okay? So let's recap. The conduction system has 4 parts: SA node, AV node, bundle of His, and Purkinje fibers. SA node is located within the right atrium. Its function is to actually start the impulse, therefore it's called a pacemaker. The SA node fires, gives the impulse to basically both of the atria, and the impulse arrives to the second segment, which is the AV node. The function of the AV node is to slow down the impulse, thereby to ensure that the ventricles get enough time to fill with blood. From the AV node, the impulse actually arrives to the bundle of His. The function of the bundle of His is just to spread the impulse to basically to the ventricle, so give it to the ventricle, so the last segment, which is the PGA fibers. The bundle of His is actually found within the interventricular septum. And then the last segment is the PGA fibers, which basically receives the impulse, and the PGA fibers are found within the ventricles, and their function is to spread the impulse to the ventricles. So that was the conduction system. Now, let's look at the action potential of basically the SA node. So as I said, SA node is the pacemaker, and it has a different or unique action potential. So this is what we're going to cover now. This image displays the action potential of a SA node. Okay, so the resting minimum potential is negative 60 millivolts. Threshold is negative 40 millivolts, and yes, you should know those numbers. Now, the SA node action potential has 3 phases: phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is called the pacemaker potential. So the phase 1 is called pacemaker potential. Okay. Phase 2 is called depolarization. And phase 3 is called repolarization. Now let's see which channels and which ions are responsible for basically every single phase. So the pacemaker potential is due to opening of voltage-gated slow sodium channels. The key word is slow. Voltage-gated slow sodium channels. Because these channels are slow in closing, they're actually called the funny channels. So they're also referred to as IF channels. I stands for channel, F stands for the funny. So voltage-gated slow sodium channel, which is called the IF channel, funny. Okay. Now once these voltage-gated slow sodium channels open at basically negative 60 millivolts, sodium is coming into the cell, making the cell positive. So as you can see, because sodium is a cation and it's coming in, it's causing the membrane to become positive and reach threshold. So the function of the pacemaker potential is to take the resting membrane potential towards threshold. As soon as negative 40 is reached, voltage-gated slow sodium channels close. And now you go into phase 2 of the action potential, which is called depolarization. Now, which channel is responsible for depolarization? It is opening a voltage-gated calcium channel. So, at negative 40 millivolts, voltage-gated calcium channels open, calcium comes into the cell. So in SA node action potential, depolarization is due to influx of calcium. that keeps on happening. Calcium is a cation, so it's taking your membrane potential towards positive, so it's making it more positive. Now, it keeps on doing that until it reaches positive 5. At positive 5 millivolts, voltage-gated calcium channel is closed, and we end depolarization. And then the third phase that starts is repolarization. So, repolarization is due to opening of voltage-gated potassium channel at positive 5. As soon as positive 5 voltage-gated potassium channel is open, potassium starts leaving the cell. Potassium is a cation, so anytime a cation leaves, it causes the membrane to become negative. And as you can see, the membrane is becoming negative. Now, when does these voltage-gated potassium channels close? At negative 60 millivolts. So as soon as you reach negative 60 millivolts, voltage-gated potassium channels close, and basically repolarization ends. At that point, a new action potential starts, meaning at this point, pacemaker potential starts again, which is due to opening of voltage-gated slow sodium channel. Sodium comes in, takes it to threshold. And then you go into phase 2, which is depolarization, which is due to opening of voltage-gated calcium channel. Calcium comes in, causes the membrane to become positive. Then you go into phase 3, which is repolarization. It is due to opening of voltage-gated potassium channel. Potassium is leaving the cell, bringing the cell back down to resting membrane potential. And at that point, action potential ends, a new action potential starts. So that was the action potential of an SA node. Okay? That action potential only occurs in the SA node. This is why it's called the SA node action potential. Now, let's look at the action potential in a myocardial cell. The cells that actually contract and eject blood, the ones that contract and eject blood, those are myocardial cells, and they actually have a different type of an action potential. So this displays of an action potential of a myocardial cell. The resting membrane potential is negative 90 millivolts. Now, the myocardial action potential does not have a threshold. Okay? It has 4 phases, and it actually starts with phase 0. So first phase is called phase 0, then you go into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then phase 4. Okay? So phase 1 is called depolarization. Phase 1, okay, so this is phase 0, which is the first phase. Phase 1 is actually the second phase, which is called brief or early repolarization. So phase 1 is called brief or early repolarization. Sorry, changes to 2. So phase 2 now, which is this area right here, is called the plateau. After that, you come to phase 3, which is called repolarization. And then the last phase is phase 4, which is the resting membrane potential. So, myocardial action potential has 4 phases. Phase 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? Phase 0 is called depolarization. Phase 1 is early or brief repolarization. Phase 2 is plateau. Phase 3 is repolarization. And phase 4 is resting membrane potential. So, because it starts with 0, ideally you say it's phase 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But there are actually 5 different phases, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But because it starts with 0, we say 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? So please know phase 0 is depolarization. Phase 1 is early or brief repolarization. Phase 2 is plateau. phase 3 is repolarization, and phase 4 is resting minimum potential. This is the way I'm going to be asking you. Okay? Now let's look at which channels and ions are responsible for each phase. So, phase 0, which is depolarization, it is due to opening up voltage-gated sodium channels at negative 90 millivolts. As soon as it opens up, sodium starts coming into the cell. Sodium is a cation, so causing the membrane to become positive. At positive 5, voltage-gated sodium channels close, and we end phase 0, which is depolarization. Now, phase 1, which is brief or early repolarization, it is due to opening a voltage-gated potassium channel, and potassium starts to leave the cell. And because potassium is a cation, it starts to make the membrane negative, and this is why you see it coming down. Now, potassium is leaving, and now you go into something unique in the myocardial action potential, which is phase 2, and that is called a plateau. So plateau is unique, and it only occurs in basically a myocardial action potential. When you think of the word plateau, it basically reminds you of something flat. This is why basically this phase is called a plateau, because there's no membrane change in that time frame. So the membrane is neither getting positive or neither getting negative. It's stable, it's flat, it stays the same. This is why it's called a plateau. So now let's see, why does the membrane potential not change the voltage? What happens? So in plateau, what causes plateau is opening of voltage-gated calcium channel. So plateau occurs due to opening of voltage-gated calcium channel, and calcium is coming inside the cell. Now, it's due to opening of voltage-gated calcium channel, calcium is coming into the cell. Shouldn't the cell become more positive, right? Because calcium is a cation, if calcium is coming in, the membrane should become positive. But I just told you that plateau is a phase where the membrane potential doesn't change. So how does that occur? So calcium is coming in, but did I tell you that potassium closed, or the potassium channel closed, and potassium is not leaving? No, I did not mention that. So what happens in plateau, the reason the membrane is stable is while calcium is coming in, potassium is still escaping through the channel we just opened. So, because potassium is still leaving and now calcium starts coming in, the membrane potential starts becoming stable. And at this frame, cations are coming in, cations are coming in, cations are leaving, so the membrane potential is stable. So when you ask what causes plateau, it's opening of voltage-gated calcium channel. Okay, but if somebody asks you what is happening during plateau, the entire process, it's calcium is entering, but potassium is leaving, and this is why it's flat. Now, as soon as voltage-gated calcium channels close, and you don't need to know exactly at what voltage, just know plateau ends as soon as voltage-gated calcium channels close, and therefore there's no more influx of calcium. But potassium channels are still open, so voltage-gated potassium channels are still open, allowing potassiums to leave the cell. Because these voltage-gated potassium channels are still open, potassium is leaving the cell, causing the membrane to basically become negative. And this is when you undergo phase 3, which is repolarization. When does these voltage-gated potassium channels finally close? When you reach negative 90 millivolts, which is resting membrane potential. So at negative 90 millivolts, voltage-gated potassium channel is closed, and there's no more efflux of potassium, and therefore you are at phase 4, which is resting membrane potential. And at resting membrane potential, the voltage-gated sodium channel is open, voltage-gated potassium channel is closed, and the action potential starts again. Okay? So phase 0 is depolarization due to opening of voltage-gated sodium channel, sodium comes in. Phase 1 is early or brief repolarization. It is due to opening of voltage-gated potassium channel, potassium is leaving the cell. Then you hit phase 2, which is plateau. It is due to opening of voltage-gated calcium channel, calcium is coming in. But at the same time, potassium is leaving, and therefore the membrane potential is stable or flat. Then you go into phase 3, which is repolarization, and that occurs because voltage-gated voltage-gated calcium channel is closed, ending plateau. But the voltage-gated potassium channels are still open, potassium is leaving the cell, causing the cell to become negative, which is repolarization. Voltage-gated potassium channels close at negative 90 millivolts, which is at negative 90 millivolts, as I said, and that basically brings you back down to resting membrane potential. And at that part, which is phase 4, resting membrane potential, the entire action potential starts again. This is just an image of showing you what's happening, so you can see basically the membrane potential is at rest, then depolarization where sodium is coming in, then you go into early or brief repolarization where potassium is leaving, then you go into plateau where potassium is leaving but calcium is coming in, then you go into repolarization when potassium is leaving. That brings basically the heart back, or the cell back to resting membrane potential. Okay. Now, why is this plateau necessary? The function of this plateau is to ensure that the heart doesn't undergo, the function of this plateau is to ensure that a forceful or a strong myocardial contraction can occur. As you probably learned in the muscular system, calcium is needed for basically muscle contraction. Same in the myocardial cell. So as calcium is coming in, it's causing thick and thin filaments to interact. Therefore, a stronger, more powerful contraction can occur. Therefore, proper ejection of blood can occur. So action potential lasts around or more than 200 milliseconds, which is largely due to plateau. This ensures the tension develops properly, and it provides substantial ejection. Refractory period in the myocardial action potential is basically longer than the action potential itself, and this is to ensure that tetanic contractions don't occur. You want your heart to go contract, relax, contract, relax. You do not want it to go like this, which is called tetanic contractions, and that could be dangerous. This is just a slide for you so you can practice. Same for you, so you can practice. Okay, now let's talk about the ECG. Now, ECG is a way to actually measure the electrical activity of the heart. ECG or EKG is the same, electrocardiogram. In the ECG, you have two different types of leads. You have bipolar leads and unipolar leads. Bipolar leads are because they look at the heart in two different angles, and they're actually placed on the limbs. So the bipolar leads are placed on both of the hands and one of the limb. When they are placed, you actually form a triangle. Unipolar leads are placed on the heart, okay, and it basically looks at the heart in one direction. I mean, you place it on the chest, right where the heart is, and it's only looking at the heart from one direction. And these are the unipolar leads. Okay. So here is basically ECG. ECG has different waves, as well as segments, as well as intervals. So this is the P wave, Q wave, R wave, and then the T wave. So you have the P wave, Q wave, R wave, S wave, and then the T wave. Now, because this is 3 smaller waves, we actually call the QRS complex. So you never say Q wave, R wave, S wave. It's collectively called as a QRS complex, which I can't reach it, but it would be written in this red box up here, QRS complex. So the ECG has a P wave, QRS complex, and a T wave. Apart from the waves and the complexes, you have intervals and segments. So you have the PR segment and you have the ST segment. Apart from the segments, you have the intervals. So this entire thing is called a PR interval, and this entire thing is called the QT interval. Okay? Now, let's see which each wave represents. So a P wave represents atrial depolarization. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, and the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. Now, the U wave is an abnormal wave. In a healthy individual, you will not see a U wave. Okay? It's a pathological wave. Now, you see P wave is atrial depolarization, QRS complex is ventricular depolarization, and a T wave is ventricular repolarization. Does that mean that the atrias don't repolarize? No, of course not. They do. So why don't you actually see a separate wave for that? It's because when the atrias are under repolarization, the ventricles are under depolarization. And because the ventricles are so much bigger and thicker, the electrical activity they produce kind of covers up what these teeny, lighty atrias are doing. Therefore, we say that the atrial repolarization is embedded or hidden within the QRS complex. It's because it's occurring at the same time, you see the bigger person. Okay? Now, let's correlate the ECG with the conduction system. But before I do that, let me say one thing. So we talked about what the waves mean. What does the PR interval and the ST segment mean? So the ST segment is the plateau. Remember the myocardial action potential? You had depolarization, plateau, and then repolarization. And what is the PR interval? It is very important. It is basically the impulse going through the AV node. Okay? So now let's connect the conduction system with the ECG. And I'm going to use this slide because it's more clear to understand. So, SA node fires, okay, causing the P wave to occur. Then the impulse is going through the AV node, goes down the bundle of His, arrives at the PGA fibers, allowing the ventricles to undergo depolarization. Then the ventricles undergo plateau, and then the ventricles undergo repolarization. As I mentioned, while the ventricles are undergoing depolarization, the atrias at that time are undergoing repolarization. We just not see it. Okay. So P wave is 0.08 seconds in length. Atrias contract 0.1 seconds after the P wave begins. QRS complex is 0.08 seconds in length. T waves is 0.16 seconds in length. PR interval is 0.16 seconds in length. The video I found is actually, it causes the PQ, but usually we call it the PR. That's the difference I wanted to point out. ST segment is the plateau. Okay? Now, the ECG these time frames and everything is big, so is important. Anytime the wave is bigger, smaller, larger, wider than it's normal, it indicates there's something wrong with the heart, and this is why it's important to know. So again, this is basically correlating the what's happening in the heart and showing the ECG at the same time. So as I said, SA node fires, impulse spreads to both of the atria, causing atrial depolarization. The impulse now goes to the AV node, causing a delay, which you see is the PR segment. Then the impulse actually arrives to the, goes down the Purkinje fibers, goes down the bundle of His, arrives at the Purkinje fibers, causing the ventricles to basically depolarize, causing ventricular depolarization. Then the ventricles undergo plateau, so you see the ST segment, and then the ventricle starts to repolarize, so you see the T wave, and this is when the ventricles are finished on repolarization. Okay. So basically, the ECG ideally actually looks like this, and you're responsible to identify every single wave segment and intervals in a normal ECG like this. So here is a P wave, the PR segment, the QR is complex, ST segment, and the T wave. So P, PR, QRS, ST, T wave. P, PR, QR is complex, ST, and the T wave. Okay? Now, apart from being able to identify the normal ECG, you should be able to identify abnormal ECG. I'm not saying that it's your responsibility to look at ECG and say they have myocardial atrophy or they have cardiomyopathy or AV blood. That's not your job. That's in patho. But you should be able to look at abnormal ECG and figure out that it's abnormal. You should be able to see which wave is missing, absent, or looks abnormal. So in here, you can see that there is no P waves. So you see a PR is complex, T wave, but no P wave, no P wave. So in here, you're responsible to identify that P waves are lacking. Not that it's a junctional rhythm, nothing like that. In here, you are supposed to recognize that certain QRS complex are not being produced. So you have P wave, QRS complex, T wave, and then a P wave but no QRS complex. Then again a P wave, QRS complex, T wave, P wave, no QRS complex. Again a P wave. You're not supposed to identify it's a second degree heart block, that is patho, but at least look at ECG and say, okay, we're missing a QRS complex. And here, this is completely an ECG where the atria and ventricles are not communicating at all. This is completely chaotic. Okay? So you should be able to look at ECG and see there's something wrong with it and what is wrong. I would say just go, in Google search and just put in, ECG is lacking T waves or inverted T waves, inverted P waves, missing P waves, missing QRS complex. Just kind of look at the images like that. Okay. Question 1. P wave. So he wants to know if the cardiac surgery on the right atrium was successful. He will look at the P wave. Atrial depolarization is represented by P wave. Now let's talk about the cardiac cycle. So cardiac cycle is a sequence where the atria contract and ventricles contract, and then they eject blood. So the heart contracts, ejects, contracts, ejects. So the atria contract, eject blood, ventricles contract and eject blood. Okay? So this is the cardiac cycle. Now the cardiac cycle has two main phases. So you could say it's systole and diastole. So what does each of that mean? Systole means, actually let me start with diastole, it's easier. So diastole is when that chamber is rest and filling with blood. So diastole means that chamber is at rest or relaxed and filling with blood. The chamber is relaxed, filling with blood. So diastole is the chamber is relaxed and filling with blood. Now, both atria and ventricles undergo diastole. So you have atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. Now let's look at systole. Now systole is broken up in, well, systole has two parts. Okay, so 2/3 of the time the chamber is contracting, building pressure. 1/3 of the time the chamber is actually ejecting blood. So as I said, systole is 2/3 of that time frame. The chamber is completely closed and all it's doing is building pressure. So it's contracting. 1/3 of the time that chamber actually now ejects blood. Okay? Now both sides of the heart eject the same amount of blood, but the difference is the pressure. The right side of the heart has to pump blood pump against a pulmonary system or pulmonary circulation. Therefore, it has to generate less pressure. Why? Because pulmonary circulation is 24 millimeters or 8 millimeters per mercury. Where the left side of the heart has to pump blood against the systemic circulation, which is much greater. Systemic circulation is 120 over 80. So the left side of the heart has to, of course, generate more pressure. Okay. So this is the cardiac cycle. Now, cardiac cycle has 3 phases. Phase 1, atrial and ventricular diastole. Phase 2, atrial systole, ventricular diastole. And phase 3, ventricular systole, atrial diastole. Okay, I know just by listening to the names, you're like, what the heck is going on? Break it down. Let's focus on one phase at a time. The first thing you do is you look at the name. Okay? The first thing you basically look at is the name and you split it up. So it tells you atrial and ventricular diastole. So first figure out, what does diastole mean? Diastole means that the chamber is relaxed and filling with blood. So you solve half of it, okay? Now, once you know what the chamber is doing, figure out which chamber is doing that. So it tells you atria and ventricle. So atria and ventricles are both filling with blood. So in phase 1, atria and ventricles are both filling with blood. That's the first question you ask. What is the chambers doing? Second thing you ask is, where is the blood going? So what's happening to the blood? Is it coming in or is it leaving? So it says the atria and the ventricles are both filling with blood. So where does the atria get the blood from? On the right side, it comes from the superior inferior vena cava. From the left side, it's coming from the pulmonary vein. Okay? So as you can see, blood is coming in from the inferior and superior vena cava, filling the right atrium. On the left side, It's coming in via the pulmonary vein. Now, we answered what happening in the atria. What's happening to the blood in the ventricles? The ventricles are also filling with blood. Where is the left ventricle getting the blood from? From the left atria. Where is the right ventricle getting the blood from? From the right atria. So we answered our second question, what is happening to the blood? Third question you ask yourself is, what is the state of the AV and the semilunar valves? So, what is the state of the AV valves? Well, if blood is going from the atrias into the ventricles, the AV valve must be open. Now, what is the state of the semilunar valves? Since the ventricles are just filling with blood, the semilunar valves are closed. So in phase 1, AV valves are both open, semilunar valves are both closed. So in phase 1, both atrias and ventricles are filling with blood. Therefore, blood is coming into the atrias, coming into the ventricles, and therefore the AV valves are open, but the semilunar valves are closed. That's end of phase 1. Now we go into phase 2. Phase 2 is atriosystole, ventricular diastole. So again, as I said, first split it up, what are the chambers doing? It tells you atrial systole. Systole means contracting and ejecting blood. Which chamber is doing that? Atria. So the atrias are contracting and ejecting blood. What are the ventricles doing? They're under diastole, meaning the ventricles are relaxed and filling with blood. So the atrias are ejecting blood, ventricles are filling with blood. That answered your first question. Second question, what is happening to the blood? So in terms of in terms of the atrias are ejecting blood into the ventricles. What is happening to the ventricles? They're actually receiving blood from the atrias. That answered your second question. And your third one, what is the state of the semilunar valves and the AV valves? Because blood is going from the atrias into the ventricles, the AV valves are open. The semilunar valves, because the ventricles are filling with blood, the semilunar valves are closed. Now, blood is going from atrias into ventricles in this space. Blood is going from atrias into ventricles in this space. But in here, atrias are not contracting. In here, atrias are contracting. What changed? Why does the heart or does the atrias have to contract in phase 2? It's because of the pressure. So in phase 1, I'm just going to use a red pen. Ventricles had really little blood. Atrias had a lot of blood. So low volume here, high volume in the atrias. Therefore, atrias had higher pressure, ventricles had low pressure, so blood was passively able to go because everything always goes from high to low. Now, when you start phase 2, story has reversed. The ventricles are basically almost full, where the atrias barely have any blood. So ventricles now have higher pressure compared to the atrias. How does the atrias get this last amount of blood into a ventricle which is already full? Well, when they contract, they build pressure, and then the pressure increases, and therefore they're able to eject the blood out. Okay, so now we get into phase 3, which is ventricular systole, atrial diastole. In here, again, ask yourself, what is the chambers doing? Ventricles are contracting and ejecting blood. Atrias are relaxed and filling with blood. What is happening to the blood? So ventricles, that's your second question. Ventricles are actually, the blood is, in the first phase, because systole, 2/3 of the time the chamber is contracting. So the chamber is completely closed, building pressure. And in the last portion, the chamber now ejects the blood. Atrias are relaxed, filling with blood. Okay. What is the state of the AV valves? So in the first phase, the first part of phase 3, because the ventricles are contracting, trying to build the pressure, the chamber is completely closed. 2/3 of the time, the chamber is closed, just building pressure. So the AV valves, semilunar valves are closed. And towards the end, is where it's ejecting blood, so the semilunar valves open, trying to eject the blood into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Okay? So that answers what's happening in the ventricles. Now let's look at the atria. The atria are basically relaxed filling with blood. So if the atria are relaxed filling with blood, basically the AV valves are closed during the entire time. So phase 3 is broken up into early and end. In early, the AV valves are closed, semilunar valves are closed. All the ventricles is doing is contracting, trying to build the pressure. And the atria are just passively receiving blood. Now you go into basically the end part. In the end part of phase 3, the AV valves are still closed, but the semilunar valves open up, so blood can be ejected into the offgoing vessel. Okay? Now, why was the atria trying to, why was the ventricles trying to build pressure? The reason is, remember the systemic circulation and the pulmonic circulation have a pressure, right? So to open up the pulmonic valve and the aortic valve, you need to build pressure. So example, okay. In the left ventricle, when you start phase 1, in the ventricles, when you start the beginning of phase 3, the pressure inside the ventricles is 80 millimeters per mercury, where in the systemic circulation is 120 over 80, and this was 80 over, let's say, 40. Okay? So of course, this is low, this is high. Blood always goes from high to low. So this is why in the first part of phase 3, the ventricles is completely closed. All it's doing, trying to build pressure. So slowly, while it's putting pressure, the pressure is starting to increase. And finally, it becomes 121, okay, over, let's say, 90. So as soon as this becomes 121, this is higher than this pressure, then the aortic valve opens, blood can be ejected. Okay? Whereas in the atria, at the beginning, it barely had blood because it just emptied blood in phase 2, so it barely had blood in the atria. And by the time you finish phase 3, atria have a lot of blood, and ventricles have now just ejected the blood. So the pressure reverses. Ventricles have little blood, atria have more blood, then that causes the AV valves to basically open, and the cycle starts again. What causes the semilunar valves to close? As soon as the blood has been ejected, ventricles have low pressure, atria have high pressure because they were building with blood. And therefore, that causes the semilunar valves to close, and the cycle starts again. Okay, heart sounds. So, blood should always flow in one direction and uniformly. You should never hear blood flow. If you do, that means there is a problem. Now, heart sounds are sounds which are created when the valves close. So we have two sounds. We have S1, S2. S1 is the lub, S2 is the dub. So it goes lub dub, lub dub. What causes the S1 or the lub? It's the closure of the AV valves. What causes the S2 or the dub? It's the closure of the semilunar valves. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Frank-Starling law. Frank-Starling law states that as much as you stretch the ventricles, okay, the more you stretch the ventricles, thick and thin filaments align better. When thick and thin filaments align better, it allows a more stronger contraction to occur. And if there's a stronger contraction, more ejection of blood can occur. But of course, to a limit. What happens if you keep on stretching it? The thick and thin filaments completely disalign. You're not going to have a forceful contraction at all. You won't be able to eject blood. And if you keep on stretching, at one point, you're going to tell the ventricle. So if you don't basically stretch a ventricle, thick and thin filament are not aligned, you don't usually get a strong contraction. But as you start stretching, thick and thin filaments align better, causing a stronger contraction, better ejection. And then, basically, if you keep on going, thick and thin filaments disalign, not a good contraction, and if you keep on going, you're going to tear the ventricle. And this is what the Frank-Starling law says. Okay, question 3. So aortic valve should open a bit ventricular systole. we are done with the heart.